Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 22 cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's an FPL series where we look at all the price points in the game positionally and look at effectively the efficiency of certain players over the short term, the medium term, the long term with a decade approach, and looking at my understanding of minutes, the underlying data that we've seen so far, my appreciation of models, and even let's say market odds and things like that. So starting with Game Week 22 in the midfield, what I would say about this juncture in the landscape is we do have a double coming up soon. It's not that important in that I assume a lot of people are already pre-invested into Liverpool and arguably have one or none Everton players in their team. And that still seems fine because we don't have such a preference to owning Everton players right now because they're so tilted towards defense. And I don't think that's dramatically going to change, unfortunately, with the bodies that they have within the team for now. And yes, we expect Moyes to probably tilt the defense a little bit more into a direction where they're not so much of a team where they're just sitting back and either going for a 0-0 or a 0-1. Obviously, that's not the intention. They're trying to win games as well. But realistically, that's kind of the production that we're starting to see from this Everton team quite consistently. They had some good chances per game, but DCL's also taking a few of them. So this is a decent game week to maybe consider some of the Everton players, because there's a nice home game here, which I quite like. However, there's a little bit of uncertainty around who you really want to go for in the double. And I still think that that's going to reside over the next few weeks. So it doesn't really make sense to make an Everton transfer anytime soon. On top of that, this is a good game week still for teams like United, arguably teams like Arsenal, teams like Crystal Palace, the teams that we've been investing into quite a fair bit, who just generally have a good fixture run. Not much has changed. However, I do think it's worth iterating on some of the teams outside of the ones that I've mentioned because they create a lot of the movements. So starting from the top, we have in the budget midfield, no changes to the green tier players. I still very much highly rate Ahmad, Rogers, Semenyo, Sarr. I think they play a lot of minutes. They produce a lot when it comes to underlying stats. And I have just general confidence in let's say, all of the minutes of these players, right? Ahmad could be playing a little bit more right wing back at times, but that's very unlikely, and he's more than likely going to continue playing within that sort of right 10 position. As far as Rogers, he's pretty much solidified a spot in the team. Yes, Buendia is getting some minutes at times, but he's not even a like-for-like sub. They did sign Malin, and I just see that really as a Philogene replacement, and McGinn is still injured for now, although Arsenal's not a great game, but he's still a very, very great pick, and just a top-tier player compared to Semenyo and Sarr as well, who've, for this season, shown extremely impressive underlying numbers so far. Dango has been added because he is very interesting to me. We've mostly seen him on the left so far, but up until these striker injuries, that's probably all we had to live off of Dango. But now with the center forward spot gone, and I still think the lack of, I guess, rating of Jebinson, it's so likely that Dango is going to continue playing a mixture of heavy center forward minutes and then winger minutes out wide. So I really do like Dango as a pick. Generally speaking, I'd say anytime you can have a winger moving towards a center forward position, that should be a net positive on that player and the production that they can lead to. One thing I will say about Dango this season is that he has been underperforming some of his finishing. He's gotten a fair few assists so far, but he's still such an interesting prospect, and I really like him at this price point. In fact, he's my favorite pick if you could guarantee the minutes going forwards. But the only issue really that these former players are suffering from is just poor fixtures. And you can't really deal with that up until 25. With Murphy, I think he gets a soft drop. Murphy's minutes have remained really good, but I still think going forwards that Barnes is probably going to take more minutes from someone like Murphy as long as he's coming back. We know Barnes is currently dealing with an injury, and maybe that gives Murphy more minutes in the meantime. But we're also starting to approach close to the end of the Newcastle fixture. So 3-4 game weeks later down the line, do I see Murphy as such a great hold? Probably not. I'd still value some of the other picks because I think generally they're a little bit more fixture proof. And that might just be my bias towards some of the historical data, some of the other players, or the idea that they are young, growing, prospective players versus someone like Murphy, who I would think is quite an established player, but he clearly has shown signs of improvement. And as I've said within my series, is also someone who's benefiting from simply playing within an attacking wide position as opposed to a mixture of a defensive wingback role. Kluivert, I don't really know why he was actually sitting on the bench, but nothing was really mentioned about it. It didn't seem like he was ill. Fortunately for him, he was able to come on very early within the game versus Chelsea, which also meant that he was able to take a penalty. And we also, conversely, didn't get to see who would be taking penalties outside of Kluivert, given that Evan Nilsson's injured, which I don't like. But my best guess would be Semenyo maybe has some claim to it. And Kluivert, I still see as a player who's not really a 90-minute player. He is still going to be subbed early, and I still think with the lack of depth available that that's going to be the case. So that's why I don't see him necessarily as a green pick, even though he is playing for a very competent, high-functioning attacking team. It's just his open play numbers are also a little bit subpar. With Enzo, I actually still like him a lot. The immediate games to Chelsea are very nice, and Lavia coming back does, in my opinion, bolster Enzo. He had plenty of chances and opportunities created within the previous match, and I'm expecting more from Enzo, to be quite honest, in terms of production going forwards. And so if you're someone who's actually held Enzo reluctantly, I actually think that this is, a great game in Game Week 22, but you still have really good fixtures in the distance where Enzo doesn't necessarily need to be a priority sell. With Paquetá, I've had him previously on the sheet, and then we had Potter join the team, and now I'm very confident that he's going to be a pretty decent pick, especially since we saw him play a little bit of center forward, which, as I said, going back to the Danko point, is a huge boost, generally speaking, to how we envision how players can provide and do well from a sort of goals and assists point of view. Iwobi, yes, he scored a brace in a good game on paper, but I still think his general production is what it is. And of course, if anyone's actually seen the chances and even, let's say, the assists, quote unquote, for those Iwobi chances, then I mean, there's not too much to be said. I think Iwobi is still a very strong pick. He gives you really consistent minutes, but do I like him more than some of the other picks? Not really. In the next tier, we have Eze. No real changes there. I have dropped Martinelli. I do think that Sterling's performance was absolutely awful, but you have to say that it's not great that Martinelli can be missing and really starting from the bench in a Tottenham at home game. And I don't see Sterling necessarily completely out of the team after a really lackluster performance, but at the same time, it just shows you that Arteta probably doesn't have the same confidence levels on Martinelli. And Trossard actually had a pretty decent outing as well on the left. And you'd argue that just from what we've seen so far of a short sample of Martinelli right wing, probably something that you'd less likely to want. As far as the next tier, I've actually given Diogo Jota a rise, and that's because I'm not expecting Luis Diaz's minutes to be suddenly really poor. I think really the minutes should be shared between the three players that would be Diaz, Gakpo, and Jota, and Nunez is a little bit on the periphery in terms of being able to get consistent minutes. But Jota put in a really good performance in the second half, and it's very likely that he'll actually get that Brentford game, and possible that you see a little bit of rotation in the Champions League, and maybe you get Jota versus Ipswich at home. I still think it's a little bit punty to go Jota because the minutes are still not guaranteed, and we can see Luis Diaz and also Darwin even playing in the future, right? Because Darwin was suspended for the Nottingham Forest game, hence why you don't see an additional substitution there. So, in my opinion, someone like Darwin does taper off the ceiling of a Jota in terms of his minutes going forward. As far as, let's say, Bruno, Odegaard, Foden, and Son, I've added Son back into the cheat, and that's simply because we're starting to reach the tail end of the bad Tottenham fixtures, and we do still think that they're potentially a team that won't blank in Game Week 29. That really depends, of course, on a result that happens a little bit later with the second leg of the Carabao Cup, but Son has, for the most part, still really strong minutes. Hopefully still is on penalties, although that's quite dubious, but it's still a very generally strong pick. I still think at his price point, he's not really worth it. Foden's minutes have been really good, and I think probably it's my error to have dropped Foden to a differential. It might seem like reaction to, let's say, the brace, but I was also concerned that there might be more opportunities for Foden to be early subbed, like, for example, 2 matches ago. And I'm not really sure if he will suffer that going forwards, because it does seem like, to be honest, he's one of the few players who's actually producing for the team. I would say that Pep is also someone who is not really reacting to form, but he is clearly someone who is aware of what he needs, and he needs production. And Foden, being one of the few players who has actually done that recently, I think gives him a little bit more security of minutes going forwards. My concern, as I said, going back to Foden, was just minutes. And now I don't think that concern really arises within the short term. And you still have great games like Ipswich, for example. But there is still an Arsenal away fixture in the distance, which isn't great. And as far as the forwards, because there's nothing to talk about with the premiums, Calvert-Lewin is someone who gets added to the sheet. I mean, he is very much an irrelevant pick, for now. I think that, yes, he's shown really poor finishing, but it doesn't mean that he's incapable of scoring a goal ever again. Is he a good pick that I would recommend now? No. But is he someone that if you, let's say, had a dead spot in the forward position that you can go for? Potentially, yes. What I don't love about Calvert-Lewin is that there's still a little bit of uncertainty around how important Beto is to Moyes. There's also uncertainty around whether Calvert-Lewin could actually still leave at the end of this transfer window, which would still have impacts on the double. So I don't like transferring Calvert-Lewin now. I much prefer Ndiaye, but we also know that Ndiaye doesn't have penalties when Calvert-Lewin's on the field, and the positions that he's taken up for this season under the previous manager aren't great. If he moves further forward in the pitch, then maybe we're talking about a different player and we have much more interest in Ndiaye. But for now, still someone that I'm not very intrigued with. With João Pedro, I've taken the asterisks away from him because it seems like he's been involved in training. And these were my assessment of photos posted by the Brighton social media account on Wednesday, the 15th of January. So it seems like he'll probably be fine going forwards. As long as João Pedro is reasonably close to coming back to playing football, he's going to be a green pick for the most of the season, and you guys know that. With Wissa, I think he deserves a massive rise, and I have to say, I've been quietly saying, or not even quietly saying, but I've been constantly saying that I do think that Wissa overperformed at the start of the season and that his baselines were really high. And now I probably have to swallow what I've said and actually just ultimately admit that Wissa has continually shown gradual development year on year as a player in terms of playing within that center forward position, consistently being able to get into good goal scoring chances per game. And we're more than halfway through the season. If you look at his, let's say, FBref page, you'll see continuous improvement. I don't think there's much to say against Wissa. He's just a very, very good player and at a really good price point, despite not being on penalties. With Wood, he has the best of both, but clearly inferior underlying stats. His production has still been absolutely incredible because he's one of the best finishers in the league this season, which is a contrast to previous seasons. With Wood, one of the tricky things that I would say about Nottingham Forest is, yes, they've been playing extremely well as a team. Yes, they probably deserve the placement in the league that they have. And arguably, a lot of the cleans that they've actually gotten are deserved on the basis that they are actually a very high functioning defense, and their expected goals conceded rank supports that. And arguably, Wood gets a large share of what is still, I think, a little bit of a worse attack compared to how good they are as a defense. With Wood, though, I still think the fixtures are going to get worse, basically post 22. And so I, as a Wood owner, I'm still considering ways out of Wood, but I can also understand why someone wants to hold someone like that, because the forward position is a little bit dry, is a little bit dry for options. And I completely understand someone who wants to just look into the consistency of the goals and the actual output and still very much be comfortable owning someone who's just performing so well and playing so well. In the next tier, we have Solanke getting a rise, and that's because the games are looking better. Havertz is just going to benefit more from the injuries, unfortunately. He's been playing really poor, right? Like really poor finishing, probably low in confidence. Hard to say that that's going to stop in the future, and maybe a lot of people will react harshly to why I've given him a rise, but I think just more consistent minutes going forward just mean that Havertz is going to benefit from games like Wolves, like games like Man City at home and Leicester. So ultimately, that's the pro for Havertz, and we've seen him get opportunities. I don't think he's incapable of finishing because he still scored quite a few goals this season somehow. And similar to Jackson, I think is a very strong pick still. But I can totally understand why people are peeved with these players because recently the finishing has basically gone extremely cold, and it can yo-yo with players who are not distinguished finishers. With Cunha, he gets re-added to the sheet. It seems like he's still sort of managing his hamstring issue, and so with these kind of fixtures, there's no real need to be buying Cunha anytime soon, so I've got no interest in him. With Watkins, it was actually really nice to see him play versus Everton and actually put in a really good performance. It actually seems like he might be able to keep his spot in the team. So actually, maybe come after Game Week 22, I can reassess where my position is on Watkins. But it's also a tricky thing where I think structurally, as I've been saying recently, it's very hard to justify going for both Isak and Watkins when arguably a lot of the midfielders are still players that I would prefer over Watkins. But it's always a choice and always a preference of structure. Moving towards the defense now, we have not too many changes in defense. And I think, once again, this goes back to the start of the video where I said there aren't going to be a lot of changes this week because a lot of the gradual sort of team model shifts that we've been appreciating, a lot of the fixture swings that we've been appreciating are still relevant, and not much has really changed in terms of, are we suddenly moving from Arsenal players to City players or Liverpool players? And so we're still waiting for that double to come along. And a lot of the teams that just had good fixtures in the interim, like Newcastle and Palace, still have those good fixtures. So nothing has really changed there. But Murillo is obviously a cheaper option than Milenkovic, so really good access to a great defense at that sort of price point. And you can't really go too wrong with Nottingham Forest defense this season, given the price. Mikolenko has been given a very soft rise, and that's seeing him start versus Moyes, I think is a positive sign. Am I 100% certain that he's going to play both the fixtures in the double? No, but I just struggle to believe that he's going to lose his spot, to be quite honest. I don't think he's been playing nearly as bad as some of the fans would be suggesting, and I think maybe the manager might share those thoughts. I could be wrong, right? And so you're just taking one person's point of view, but those are my thoughts, Mikolenko. As far as the rest of the tier of players, I mean, these are all very competent defenses. The only issue for, let's say, Bournemouth is that the fixtures in the interim are poor. The issue for Aston Villa is that they're kind of up and down, so it's really about rotation. And then with Fulham as well, they've actually been conceding quite a few goals recently, but I think I'd also encourage looking at some of the opportunities they've conceded from an underlying data point of view. Fulham have actually still been a very, very good defense. And unfortunately, even when you look at, let's say, the West Ham game, I mean, that's just mistakes really created by the team. Like, they conceded less than 1 XGC and conceded 3 goals. That happens. Whereas a team like Leicester or a team like Newcastle, they were really both struggling at different aspects of the game. Crystal Palace gave a lot of chances to Leicester away in both halves, whereas Newcastle were definitely under pressure over the last 10, 15, 20 minutes of the game. And arguably didn't really deserve to keep their clean sheet. But that happens, and there are swings like that from time to time. I wouldn't suddenly think that Fulham's a bad defense. A lot of people might take issue with where I've rated Robinson, and to be honest, I just have to say look at the assists and also look at some of the underlying stats. Yes, of course, he's clearly overperforming his assists, but if you're telling me that someone is overperforming their assists, I can't say that that's necessarily predictive of future overperformance of assists, because you're assisting people who are trying to finish. So unless we're saying that Fulham are chock full of players who are just extreme overperformers, then it's very hard to say that Robinson is going to continue to provide this sort of level of overperformance in terms of his assists. But is he still a very strong pick in the game? And if you owned him, let's say at 4.5, 4.6, and you've bagged all these price rises, fair enough. I mean, there's nothing really to complain about there. He's still a very, very good pick in the game. He's got really good fixtures. My thoughts on players like Colin Munoz haven't changed. Kirk, I think, is going to be a great player after the fixture swing comes really to an end for Bournemouth. And unfortunately, City defense is still very much poor. Guardiola's still quite attacking, so that's kind of why he features. I've dropped Lewis entirely from the cheat sheet because we're starting to see his minutes get a little bit dicey, particularly against the physical teams. And ultimately, if you can't guarantee consistently starting for a team that's not even a very good defense right now, then what's the point? The same applies to someone like Colwell too, where unfortunately Chelsea, their level of performance has clearly dropped from my expectations. Over this run of great, easy games, I would say that they have definitely, on actuals and on expected data, definitely underperformed against market expectations, against team model expectations. And we kind of have to adjust going forwards, right? And unfortunately, Chelsea just don't look like a great defense. As far as other aspects, Robertson is still someone I think the minutes are very dicey. I mean, Tsimikas can clearly take the minutes from Robertson, and particularly one game within the double, if need be. And with Saliba and Virgil, I still think they're very strong picks, but Konate is probably the pick that I'd still go with, even though he was subbed off a little bit earlier as well, whilst Liverpool were trying to, I would say, overwhelm Nottingham Forest in the second half of the game. Does that suddenly mean that Konate is prone to subs? No, because I don't think it was a like-for-like sub, such as in the case of Kwanzaa in Game Week 1. It was a little bit more of game state, and I don't see Konate necessarily struggling with minutes too much, but he must be managed over this period because he himself has mentioned that he is struggling to kind of come back to full fitness over this injury. As far as the goalkeepers, rounding off on that, I've left an asterisk on Kepa because it still seems like there might be a small opportunity for Mark Travers to actually stay as the starting goalkeeper of the team and get more starts, because we have seen Kepa benchings outside of the Chelsea game. So that is a bit concerning. So I probably wouldn't recommend buying him, but it's a really good defense to be invested into. With Dubravka, we know that Pope is coming back soon, but he's been doing really well, and so have Newcastle. It's just always the question of whether a goalkeeper transfer is worth it. And of course, if Dubravka can get a 10-pointer, and you can predict things like that, and you can still book in, I guess, the future value of a transfer, fine, fair enough. But yeah, that's why I still have him as a differential pick. Otherwise, the cheat sheet is very much exactly where it is. I do think a lot of things are at status quo because, as I said, you still have, unfortunately, doubles coming that we have been anticipating for a long time, which means it's probably how you manage around goalkeeper transfers to maximize around doubles and expected points and things like that. But that's it for the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.